Good, good evening, everyone. How are you? Having a night, I guess. So, in this TED Talk today, I would give an insight into how Indonesia can prosper and how values and culture as a whole plays a very important role in allowing a country to prosper. I won't be able to say everything on how Indonesia can be rich, as my experience is still very shallow, and that's all, frankly enough. So, to begin this talk, in 1988, 74 Nobel Prize winners made the assertion in Paris that if human beings would like to live in peace and prosperity in the 21st century, they must look back 2,500 years and seek the wisdom of Confucius. Now, the 21st century is upon us, and the advice of 30 years ago is now more important than ever. First, however, I would like to ask you guys a question. What is Indonesia? What is the first thing that springs into your mind or pops into your head when you hear the word Indonesia? I've heard people saying that Indonesia is the most beautiful land in the world. I've heard some people say that the first thing that pops into their head is perhaps the batik or the great clothing from Flores. And others, they say that Indonesia have very great food, which is exotic, such as the rendang, for an example, or the sate padang, or perhaps the durian, which some people love because the taste is like heaven, not minding the awful stench of the durian. However, personally, for me, as a 17-year-old boy living in Indonesia for over 10 years, Indonesia is a heaven in the world, a jewel in Southeast Asia, because there's no culture that I have seen in my eyes that is as diverse, as rich, or as beautiful as Indonesia. To understand how Indonesia can prosper, let me tell you a story. This story takes place 1,000 years ago, which is a legend among the people of Western Java, the Sundanese. There once was a beautiful young woman known as Dayang Sumbi. She then had a son who she gave a name that would be familiar to just many people in Bandung, which is Sangkuriang. Many of us are aware as well that Indonesia have abundant natural resources. There is gold, there is oil in Papua. Some people even say Papua is the fallen heaven. And there's also numerous volcanoes around Java that makes the soil of Java rich. And I quote from Thomas Stamford Raffles, "If the entire soil is utilized, there can be no region in the world that can match the quantity, quality, and variety of plants that this island can produce." And this is true because I know that one of the best coffee beans, in fact, come from Indonesia, such as the Toraja or the Robusta from Bali. In other words, this is a country that should not have been poor. From the story that I've told you before, you could also see that it further reinforces my contention that Indonesia's culture is just very rich. Anyway, back to the story. Sangkuriang then wanted to marry his mother because he was suffering from amnesia, which his mother inflicted upon him when a spoon struck his head. To prevent the marriage from happening, Dayang Sumbi then set just an impossible task that Sangkuriang has to fulfill in order to marry her, or in other words, win her heart. This task is first, that he must build a big boat, and second, that he must build a lake, and that it must be finished by dawn in the next morning. Fortunately, Sangkuriang confidently accepted this task. This example from the story shows that the impossible is possible, and that it is up to the human whether a task can be done or not. Sadly, however, the reality now is that countries with no natural resources or can become rich because they can utilize the human resources within their different sectors which is seen in Sangkuriang, that the human has great capabilities to allow the impossible to be reached. And if you notice as well that creativity is what is mostly missing in Indonesia's youth today. A few hundred years ago, the Scottish naturalist John Muir quoted, "The power of imagination makes us infinite." And that is especially true in today's conditions, because we have seen sometimes it's the very people that we don't imagine anything of who do the things that no one could possibly ever imagine. And what is even more terrific is that we have seen countries with no abundant natural resources or raw materials, as you say, it's like no oil, no coal, no gas, as small as Singapore or as big as South Korea, transform itself from one of the most poorest countries in the world into developed nations. Next, I would end the tale of Sangkuriang, and I would tell you that he did succeed in making this boat, as he held help from the spirits above. Unfortunately, Sangkuriang's mother realized that Sangkuriang would overcome this seemingly impossible challenge. So she prayed for divine intervention. Feeling he was deceived because he knew that it was a trick and that his endeavor has failed, Sangkuriang thus kicked the boat so that it toppled over. This boat thus became known as Tangkuban Perahu Mountain, and the lake became known as Lake Bandung. So, ladies and gentlemen, here ends the tale of Sangkuriang. And the moral of it is, if you don't know, is that somebody should keep his word or her word. Now, of course, I would go on towards the core of this concept of what I've been talking before, which is, so how can we know why these countries that I've told you before can become an Asian tiger, or as some call them, while they are uniquely poor before? In Asia, some of these values and dynamics are reinforced by important dynamics such as Confucian values, but this also can happen because these countries adapted towards those ethics and embrace it. Yes, it will be a challenge for Indonesia to have this concept and method apply here, but it may be one of the best hopes that we have. But first, why I advocate this method and philosophy towards Indonesia is, first, it advocates social stability, and second, the other important component of this philosophy is of hard work and filial piety. Hard work is of course important because when you need to reach something, of course, you have to struggle in order to reach this goal or this achievement that you want to have. And third, I advocate this because Confucianism also strongly encourages tolerance and discourages insubordination. I believe strongly that Indonesia should follow this example. However, at the same time, if we do practice this Confucian philosophy or ethic, Indonesia's culture cannot be ignored at the same time. In other words, the culture must be preserved. Try thinking of the most delicious Indonesian delicacy that you have tried, and it then vanishes in thin air. In my case, it's nasi goreng. How does that feel? Horrifying, isn't it? But it's not only that. If a segment or a part of culture disappears, your identity vanishes at the same time, including for myself, it may be agonizing as a whole to realize that something you hold dear could just suddenly vanish into thin air. About the culture in here, in my opinion, Indonesian culture is very unique and refined, or kental, as you say it in Indonesian. Many people I've met, such as people from Europe or from other parts of Asia, say that they are just astounded by its beauty and its richness. And this comes from its philosophy and concept of rasa. Some people in Indonesia consider rasa as an organ or tool through which we apprehend the inner realities, while the mind is used to apprehend the outer realities. And this concept of rasa, which I've told you before, is especially potent in part because of the spectrum of meanings attached to it, which in some cases is smoothness in social relations and seeking perfection. This smoothness in social relations you can see, such as the smooth technique in creating the batik, or how the dalang or the puppeteer plays the wayang kulit in the show, the smooth alunan or melody in the gamelan, or the ethereal and smooth dance in the tari legong or the tari serimpi in Java, and its rich language, which is further expressed in its literature. So, in the end, there will always be a question of what we should do. I believe there are three things we should do. The first thing we can do when leaving this splendid room is to think differently and reevaluate and reflect the values that we embrace in our life. Second, we need to pay more attention to the cognitive and psychological differences of emphasis between cultures, because each culture is unique, and in other words, there must be a greater sense of appreciation and embracement of differences. And third, I believe the potential of a culture must be utilized to its fullest, not for sustainable growth, but to promote sustainable harmony. Because sustainable harmony means not only to have growth, but also reduce inequalities, which allows us not to grow quantitatively, but qualitatively. What TED and what this TEDx event celebrates is the gift of the human imagination, or in other words, the potential we have. We have to cultivate and appreciate this gift wisely so that we can face the future that is still predetermined. And our job now is to make something of the present. To end this presentation, I would like to give a quote from the author of The Alchemist, Paulo Coelho. Culture makes people understand each other better. And if they understand each other better in their soul, it is easier to overcome the economic and political barriers. But first, they have to understand that their neighbor is, in the end, just like them, with the same problems, the same questions. It's an honor for me to tell this to all of you. Thank you very much.